We have some big time risers, ladies and gentlemen, whether that's through the NFL playoffs. A few of these names actually were rising before the NFL season even ended that we need to go through and reevaluate. I've noticed that in our own Dynasty startup mock drafts that these guys are just going earlier and earlier and earlier. We need to figure out what's too early for a few of these names. But before we get into it, go down there, drop a like, subscribe if you play Dynasty. If you want to check out any of these player props this weekend, my favorite's going to be the fewer than on the total yards mark for Miles Sanders in a brutal matchup. Or if you want to get in a draft with us, of course you can on Underdog Fantasy. Link in the live chat, link in the description. When you sign up for Underdog with promo code FLOCK, they are going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to 100, and you are going to get our 2023 Dynasty rankings. So make sure you take advantage of that, but that should be it. Let's dive into this. Let's look at Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones, he was a quarterback that I actually really liked in underdog drafts in particular, given the fact that this is a man that has rushing upside. We've talked about it for God knows how long now, that while of course he's not Lamar Jackson, he's not Jalen Hurts, he is a sneaky rusher from a fantasy standpoint. We saw this back in year 2 for Daniel Jones, where the man had over 400 rushing yards. He had 30 rushing yards a game. And with Brian Daboll, he actually increased that rushing usage. He went up to 44 rushing yards per game. That's incredible. And keep in mind, with Daniel Jones, he had one of the worst supporting cast in the entire NFL, but based on this 44 rushing yards per game, he was a viable option in fantasy. He ended up winning us a decent amount of money in Best Ball Mania in the final round there. But if we're going to be looking at the stat line at the end of the season with his passing, I mean, it was incredible. There's no other way to put it. The man limits his turnovers to 5 total interceptions. 6.9 adjusted yards per pass attempt isn't great, but if you go through and look at the receivers here, we've talked about this before, but it was hideous. If we just run through it, Kenny Golladay, arguably one of the worst signings we've seen in years. Kadarius Toney falling out with this team, getting traded to Kansas City. Toney plays nothing, zip, nada for the New York Giants this year. Sterling Shepard tears his knee up. Wan'Dale Robinson tears his knee up. You have nothing. The leading receivers are Darius Slayton, Richie James, Isaiah Hodgins, and Saquon Barkley for this team. Arguably the worst wide receiver core in the entire NFL, yet he has his best season ever. I think we can safely say this is something to do with Brian Daboll. I mean, if we go over and look at Josh Allen, for instance, and of course, I don't want to say that Josh Allen is going to be a bad quarterback by any means, but I do think that you see the departure of Brian Daboll in Buffalo negatively impacting him, where Josh Allen from, a turnover standpoint, this past season actually gets up to 15 interceptions, which is right in line with Dak Prescott for the NFL lead in interceptions. The man looks more reckless. I don't know. I think Brian Daboll's a very good coach. I think they're going to re-sign Daniel Jones for the long term. Even if they don't re-sign Daniel Jones for the long term, they will be giving him the franchise tag. And I don't know exactly who they'll be bringing in at wide receiver, but what I do know is it will be 100% better than what they had this past season. If I'm going to go over and look at keep, trade, cut to figure out where Daniel Jones is currently valued, I mean, as of today, it's at 46. It's neck and neck with Tua. This does seem a little aggressive for me. I probably would still prefer Tua Tagovailoa. He's going right after Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, Javonte Williams, Jameson Williams. Interesting spot. Daniel Jones at this price point is fair and completely understandable. There are a few names that I would prefer, like we discussed with Tua. But outside of that, if you wanted to invest into Daniel Jones, I'm not going to fault you for it. Like, given the rushing upside, I can't see how it's a bad pick. But now going over to our next guy, way more expensive. I mean, literally just a cornerstone asset going forward. Trevor Lawrence, he's that guy. I mean, build your team around Lawrence. There's not too much to discuss. I mean, we're really just going through and talking about this for the 10th time with all the live streams we've done regarding Trevor Lawrence. I think that what really made him take the next step in terms of dynasty trade value, and it maybe shouldn't have, but it did, is going to be that Los Angeles Chargers game. Regardless, at the end of the season, you see his adjusted yards per attempt go from 5.2 as a rookie, arguably the league's worst starting quarterback, to 7.3 in year 2. Next season, he is getting Calvin Ridley in here. And Calvin Ridley, we'll talk about him next because this is a player that people are all of a sudden realizing, oh crap, he's going to play next season. Oh crap, last time we saw him play fully, he was an elite level wide receiver. He was a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy in 2020. And of course, that is so long ago. I can't come out here and say, yeah, Calvin Ridley was a top 3 wide receiver in 2020. That means he's going to be a top 5 wide receiver this season. No, of course, it's hard to say that. But hell, he could still very easily be a low-end wide receiver 1. He could still very easily be a high-end wide receiver 2. If I'm pulling up Calvin Ridley's keep trade cut right now, you're actually seeing a consistent rise. We were beating the drum, screaming, trade for him, trade for him, trade for him all last offseason. And now, if you pull up that chart, it is a straight linear line up in value. I mean, if you would have invested into him after the suspension, you would have got him at wide receiver 60. If you would have invested into him back in August, wide receiver 58. Now he's up to wide receiver 34. And if we look at him in comparison of some of these other wide receivers, I mean, he's going directly after Rashad Bateman. Give me Calvin Ridley over Rashad Bateman. I mean, Amari Cooper, Deontay Johnson. I'd rather have Calvin Ridley over Deontay Johnson. I mean, with how bad Deontay Johnson was this past season. And we actually just saw in a live stream mock draft that we did, someone decided to take Calvin Ridley over Christian Kirk. I think that they are going to be neck and neck. I don't necessarily know who I'm going to prefer. They're both in the same draft class. Calvin Ridley is an older wide receiver. He didn't get to Alabama until he was incredibly old, but still. I mean, the Jacksonville Jaguars look like they have a very bright future. And if we look at keep trade cut right now, someone else in Jacksonville that continues to rise in value is going to end up being Evan Ingram. Now, Evan Ingram is in such an interesting spot in that if you don't know, back after his rookie season in 2017, people were making arguments for Evan Ingram to be the tight end 1 overall in Dynasty. And it was hard to argue against it because as a rookie, Evan Ingram was literally a top 5 tight end. Evan Ingram came out dominated in New York, but of course, every single year afterwards, he was disappointing until this past season, where down the stretch, Evan Ingram turned into a true league-winning player. Now, there are a few interesting things here. Calvin Ridley is going to be added to this Jacksonville Jaguars offense, where Evan Ingram is not guaranteed a spot next season. Evan Ingram is going to be an unrestricted free agent. In my mind, it would make a ton of sense for him to go back to Jacksonville, where you have Trevor Lawrence on a rookie contract. You have so much money that you can spend there with their salary cap situation. And on top of this, hell, you performed very well in Jacksonville. No state income tax. Come on, Evan Ingram. I think most people want him to go back there, and I think he probably is going to be drafted as a borderline top 10 tight end, at least from a redraft perspective, if he ends up returning to Jacksonville. And he's only 29 years old. It's not like Evan Ingram is some old guy, and I'm always willing to invest into those veteran tight ends compared to the young studs. Now, going over to our next spot, we are going to be looking at Jared Goff, and with Jared Goff, I'm almost surprised to see his rise. Now, of course, Jared Goff had a good season. Jared Goff was good for the Detroit Lions, and the Detroit Lions dramatically improved as the year went on. But if you're looking at it, Goff had a low point of being quarterback 25 back in October to this getting up to being quarterback 16 currently. Now, if we are looking at Goff, I do not like this price point. There are a few reasons for this. I understand that everybody and their mom is sitting here going, okay, there's no shot that the Lions take a quarterback. They are fantastic on offense. They need help on the defensive side of the ball. So we are going to pencil in the Detroit Lions with the Los Angeles Rams pick that they have, which I believe is the 6th pick overall. They are going to end up going defense. They are not going to worry about... That's not a guarantee. Same thing with like Geno Smith and the Seattle Seahawks. I know everybody thinks, okay, Geno Smith's going to be the guy next year. Not a guarantee. Same thing with the team at 1. I know everybody thinks it's going to be the guy. Not a guarantee. I think any team that's at the very top of the NFL draft is in play to take a quarterback. I'm not saying they should. There's a big difference between me saying something is possible and me saying something should happen. I think Jared Goff does not have a guaranteed starting job in Detroit next year. Even if we think it should happen, I don't think it's a guarantee. And I do think Jared Goff has a capped ceiling given the way he scores fantasy points. And I don't know if that ceiling is much higher than quarterback 16. The reason for this is Jared Goff is going to have 0 rushing yards. Jared Goff's not Daniel Jones. I would be significantly more willing to invest into Daniel Jones here, a quarterback that can average 30, 40 rushing yards a game, where if Jared Goff's going to be a difference-making player in fantasy, he really does have to be like a top 3 quarterback in the NFL in passing yards if you're not going to run it all. Now, let's go to a player that Jared Goff used to play with, TJ Hockenson. Now, with TJ Hockenson, I actually drafted him a decent amount in redraft leagues this past season. And I was a little disappointed with the Minnesota Vikings trade. I thought the Minnesota Vikings landing spot was great for the long term for TJ Hockenson, but I thought for the short term, it was going to be a little painful for a tight end to transition from one offense to another because you have to learn so much at the tight end position. You essentially have to learn how to be an offensive lineman and learn how to be a wide receiver. It's why these guys take so long to develop at the NFL level. So I thought he was going to start slow in a new offense. But the man dominated. The man was immediately an elite level tight end. If you're going to be looking at his targets, 9, 10, 9, 6, 6, 8, 9, 16, 12, and then they sat the starters against Chicago. So the man's out there averaging 8, 9 targets a game in this Minnesota Vikings offense. He goes out there against the Giants, 11 targets, 129 receiving yards. Obviously, you have Jefferson here for the long term. You have Cousins here for the long term. I don't think anything in this offense is really going to be changing this next season. Maybe they add in a secondary wide receiver. But dear God, Hockenson looks like exactly what you would expect from an elite tight end prospect. He flashed early on in his NFL career. And by the time we are getting close to that second contract time, this is when you're going to get that top level production. I don't think there's anything else you could be asking for TJ Hockenson. But now let's go over to someone that's had a very impressive stretch. Let's look at Brock Purdy. Now with Brock Purdy, we've talked about him a lot during live streams as of late, sitting here trying to figure out what is going to happen next season for the San Francisco 49ers. Selfishly, this is something that I really need to know. It's not like I have Brock Purdy in a ton of leagues, but I may or may not have overdrafted Trey Lance in a ton of them. So I am obviously hoping that Lance is able to step into what I've always perceived to be the best situation in football, being the starting quarterback for a Kyle Shanahan offense surrounded by George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk, and a great offensive line. But I think it may be difficult for Brock Purdy to not be given the starting job next year if he wins this Philadelphia Eagles game. Because if we're pulling this up, of course, Brock Purdy was put into a position to succeed. This goes back to what we're talking about with rookie quarterbacks all the time. I can't claim to be some expert rookie quarterback scout, but we can say, okay, well, if quarterback A is going into a phenomenal organization that makes a correct decision after correct decision and has a great supporting cast surrounding him, aka Trey Lance in San Francisco, that's probably someone we should be investing in. Whereas if a quarterback falls a little bit later in the NFL draft, goes to a very bad situation where they're going to have to overcome this situation to find success, that's probably not something we should bet on. So Brock Purdy, I like betting on guys in this situation. I really do. Like, you can't hold it against him that he was put in such a good spot. He's had, I mean, at the time of this recording, 16 passing touchdowns, 4 interceptions. I mean, if we're going to go through and look at his adjusted yards per pass attempt, keep in mind, we do not have the Philadelphia Eagles game here. Maybe something changes with this Eagles game. But from an adjusted yards per pass attempt standpoint, 8.6. That's elite. That is very, very good. That's significantly higher than Trevor Lawrence. I don't know what to do with Brock Purdy. I would love to know what you think. But you're just put into such a good position to score fantasy points. Similarly to Jared Goff, once it is announced, if it is, that he is the starting quarterback going forward, I think maybe there'll be a sell high moment, just given the fact that at the end of the day, he has no rushing upside. So even if he finds a ton of success from a real life standpoint, maybe it'll be difficult for him to find a ton of success from a fantasy football standpoint. But I think that should be it for this. Please, if you enjoyed this video, go down there, drop a like, subscribe if you play Dynasty. Of course, if you want to check out any of these player props for this weekend, if you want to get into a draft with us or just a draft in the public lobby, you can find the link to Underdog in the live chat in the description in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK, 100% deposit match, and you'll get our 2023 Dynasty rankings. But thank you again. I appreciate you. I hope you have a great day, and I'll be good to see you with the video tomorrow.